single digits, and where the weather report says that it's 20 or 25 degrees below in Chicago, and that winter is coming. But thank you all for coming tonight. This is an opportunity for us to hear from a part of the university that is very much deeply engaged with research and analysis of data on the one hand, which of course we find throughout the university, but is also very actively engaged with implementing policies that change the very nature of social interaction in the city. And our speaker tonight, who I will not go into a lot of detail on because he will talk about the institute of which he's director and the work that they do in the course of his presentation. But our speaker tonight is someone who has been very heavily involved in one of the most sensitive and meaningful elements of changing the criminal justice system within this city and outside of it. And I think you'll find tonight that his findings are both a little of what we expected and a lot of what never occurred to us. So, Jack, you ready to start? It's a great pleasure for me to introduce my colleague and our esteemed professor here at Northeastern, Professor Jack McDivitt.
Thanks, Ted. So can you hear that okay? Great. Thank you all. Thanks for coming. As Ted said, this is wonderful. You came out on a cold night. As Emily was just saying, we compare ourselves to the Midwest, and it's not so bad, even though it is bad here. We are very fortunate to have Ted at the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. He came over to lead the Dukakis Center for us and brings such a wealth. And those of you who have come to these sessions before know his depth of knowledge about the city of Boston, about race issues in the city, about the history of the city, architecture, community relations, everything. It's just such, it makes our university a stronger place to have him here and to have his wisdom. That's something we can draw on. I'm going to talk to you about the Institute for Race and Justice today, and it's an institute that I direct, and I have some colleagues here that I'm really embarrassed to talk about it in front of. So, but it's an institute that looks at the intersection of race, ethnicity, gender, difference, and the justice system. And as you all know, that's a place where the justice system doesn't do very well. We have lots of examples of that. I'm going to go through 4 tonight and talk to you about the body camera study, but I'm also going to talk to you about some other research that we've done on racial profiling in Boston and around the country, on hate crimes, which unfortunately apparently are on the rise. The data is so poor on hate crimes, it's difficult to say definitively, but they are. So we're going to talk about a few different topics here tonight and just run through that. If I stand up here and talk all night and you just sit there and listen, it's going to be really, really boring. So I need you to ask me questions. I need you to ask for clarification. I need you to challenge me. I mean, that's wrong. That's just foolish. And we'll have a conversation, and that'll be much more interesting than having me babble on. So the obligatory PowerPoint slides, right? They have to have so many points on them. I'm not talented enough to put pictures on mine. So the Institute, Gordon Rabinovich, who's here, was one of the founding members of the Institute, was founded in 2004 by the university, by the then President Richard Freeland. I would love to say that they thought that race and justice was the most important issue in the university at the time. I don't think that's exactly right. I think that they funded some really important center in nanotechnology and another center in particle physics. And they had this other center to fund. And they didn't know what to do. They couldn't give it to the hard sciences, and I think we were the only ones in. So when they said, all right, we'll fund this center, they'll go away in a little while. Well, you know, it's 2019 and we're still here. I think that we've worked on a variety of issues. Tonight I'm going to talk about racial profiling, hate crimes, body cameras, and gun violence. We've also worked on human trafficking, capital punishment, you know, a variety of different things. So if you want to bring up other issues, we can talk about that. This is my 41st year at Northeastern University. I know. It's amazing, isn't it? When I got here in 1977, it was the largest private university in the country, had 50,000 students, it was open admission. It was a completely different place than it is today. In some ways, it was better then. We had more diversity, for example. In many ways, it's better now. We certainly have better faculty, better students, a whole variety of ways. So there's all kinds of metrics you can think about it, but it's changed. It's a different place. So, what we do at the Institute is to look at social science. So, and when we talk about racial profiling, for example, I'll go and do a community meeting. And I'll do a community meeting in Boston. And I say to the community of color, have any of you ever been stopped because of the color of your skin? And every hand in the room goes up. And then if I, exactly. And then if I say to law enforcement, who I train thousands of law enforcement officers on these topics, and I say, have you ever stopped anyone because of their color? They go, oh my God, how could you say that? That would never happen. I would never do that. I swore an oath to the Constitution and I'd never do that. And they believe it. How can you have these two realities? You can have the police believing it never happens, and you can have the community believing it happens all the time. How can we have this? If we start a conversation, unfortunately, it tends to go like this. My son was driving home, and he was pulled over by the police. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was searched, and you didn't find anything on him, and you did it just because he was black. And the police officers say, I didn't do it. I never saw you before. I didn't do it. And the conversation stops. What we do at the Institute, and other institutes here, like Gordon is, and Emily's work, is to say, well, there's one way to have a conversation, but there's another way, which is we get data, and we put the data out to hear, how does that help us to understand the reality? Not that the realities of people who've had those experiences are wrong, but it tends to be hard to get people to get past that if it's just anecdotes or stories. But if you have numbers, then they think, okay, let's talk about this. So our job is to measure things and to say, how do we measure some of these issues and try to see if we can understand whether they're occurring, to what extent, to whom, where, and try to tell a little bit of a story about that and use that as an additional point of conversation. No social science data is ever going to solve the problems, but it gives us a little bit more grounding in what's really happening so that we can at least have a conversation about it. And I'll give you some examples from each of these topic areas as we go through it. Make sense so far? Okay. You gotta stop me. All right. I'm a college professor, so we have to obligatory, when we get our PhD, we're told we have to start every lecture with a definition. It's, you know, part of your rite of passage. So we're going to think about racial profiling. We're going to think about stopping, searching, citing individuals based on their race, ethnicity, gender, or other behavior, or other characteristics other than their behavior, okay? In other words, I'm stopping you because I think you're a criminal. And my indication that you're a criminal is your race, your age. It's fascinating. Like I said, I've trained thousands of police officers on racial profiling. And I say to police officers, have you ever stopped anyone because they're black? And like I said to you, they say never happened. I said, have you ever stopped people because they're young? Oh yeah, we do that all the time. Because say a group of young people in a car, 1:30 in the morning, I'm pulling that car over. What are you looking for? Drugs, open container of beer, you know, something like that. That's what they're looking for. They think the kids are out, they're having a party, and, you know, maybe they have some marijuana, maybe they have some beer, or maybe they have something else, and they're going to search the car and see if they can find that. It's important to understand that we always talk about racial profiling in the context of the police. But if you talk to the community, racial profiling occurs in a whole kinds of settings. Shopping malls. There's a myriad of stories of people who go into shopping malls and all of a sudden have a good friend who's a plainclothes person who's walking around with them, wherever they go. Seem to be shopping in the same stores for the same items. It's amazing. Before I came back to Northeastern, and partly what sent me back to Northeastern, was I graduated college and I went to work in a Marshalls. And I ran three Marshalls department stores. And one day my regional manager came in and said, we have a new security directive. If 2 African American women come in the store, follow them. Now, trust me, people say this doesn't happen. It happens! I hope it happens less now, but it was a memo from the managers to say, this is what you do. They come in to steal, so you walk around with them. So it isn't made up. It happens. And by the same token, police do make judgments about who they're going to stop based on implicit bias that they have, or in some cases, explicit bias. So I'll say to the police when I'm training them, why did you pull these people over? They'll say, because I think they have drugs. Okay. Well, these people happen to be Latino. Why did you pull Latinos over? Because they do drugs. Okay. Did you know that the national surveys for drug use says that white people use drugs more than African Americans or Latinos? And they say, that can't be right. That can't be right. Like, no, this is the data. This isn't an opinion. This is the data. But their belief system, their stereotypes are such that, you know, that can't be the truth. So we go through and start to try to look at that and try to understand how you would measure whether the police are engaged in racial profiling. I can't ever say, as a social scientist, that a police officer saw this car coming, saw who was driving it, and pulled them over just because of who their race or ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender. I can't do that. I can't measure that. Maybe a psychologist could, but I can't as a criminologist do that. I have to look at trends and patterns. Are there patterns that indicate that certain groups are being enforced, law enforcement, enforced more than other groups? So what I'm trying to do is to measure who gets stopped and try to say, you know, okay, well, is that more or less than we should guess? So now you're going to help me. So what the first racial profiling studies did was they identified who was stopped, the race and ethnicity of everybody stopped by the police in Boston, and we had a law in 2002 in Massachusetts that required all police departments to record the race of everyone they stopped. I was part of that. They didn't like me very much. When the report came out, the police officers, some police officers drove to my house and delivered a complaint to my house, to my kids, because they were very cranky with but the idea is, okay, if I said to you the Boston police stopped 20% African Americans, what does that do for you? What would you do with that? Is that too many? Too few? What does it mean? So the first studies used the census. And they said, okay, here's the census of Boston, and here's the number of people stopped by Boston, and in Boston, let's say it's 12% African American, they stopped 24, they stopped way too many. Now, you're all smarter than the first researchers. What's wrong with using the census? It could be old, decennially, right? So it's every 10 years. They do adjust it, though, so you get a little bit better. But, what?
It's underreported for blacks and Latino.
It's underreported for anybody undocumented, African Americans, people in group quarters, a whole bunch of people.
It doesn't tell you if those people are driving cars or if
Right.
it's not.
One is, not everybody in the census drives a car. Some of you are smart enough to not have cars and insurances, so that's a good thing. But who else drives on your road in Boston? People who live in Brookline, or Cambridge,
Or New Hampshire.
or New Hampshire. So what you see is that the census tells you who lives in the city, but there are lots of other people that drive there. And so it's not that. That can't be your best measure. So we've looked at lots of different measures. We've tried to do this, I'll share with you the pretty funny thing. So we did a driving population estimate, which was very sophisticated. What we did, and this is going to get very boring, so just bear with me for 1 minute, and then, you know, you won't fall asleep, is we take the centroid of every city in Massachusetts, and we average, the average driving time that most people will drive to do anything is 30 minutes. And so we did 30 minutes around each city, and we adjusted the population for every community that touched that city that was in 30 minutes driving time of that city. This is pretty sophisticated. So we use that as a driving population estimate. You know, these include the people around you. One example, Milton, abuts Dorchester. If you just do the population of Milton, you're not getting all the people from Dorchester who drive through Milton. Just an example. But when I released the report and we found that almost all police agencies in Massachusetts were engaged in some form of racial profiling, I was on the radio and the head of the Chiefs Police Association of Massachusetts said, our method of measuring the driving population estimate was very much like Domino's pizza. And we called it the Domino Pizza Method. And that was in the Globe. But we've done stuff, as I said, looking at racial profiling in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, in Vermont, you say? But they do, God bless you. They do, they find that up by the Canadian border, who thought? They have some racial profiling going on up there. The state police in Vermont were the ones that asked to do that study. Seattle, and I got a call about 6 months ago from a county in Kansas, where Douglas County, that has Lawrence, Eudora, Baldwin, and the University of Kansas, and they wanted to do a study because they don't know if they're stopping too many people of color. One of the fascinating things about police is that they can tell you everything about the people they arrest. They can tell you where they are, where they were arrested. They can tell you what they were arrested for. They can tell you what their criminal record is. They can tell you what they were doing at the time. But if I ask them who they stopped in traffic stops, they're like, I don't know. They don't collect that data. And you know what? It's the #1 place where people interact with the police on an official basis. The most frequent place is a traffic stop. The most frequent thing you ask police, by the way, is directions. But other than that, on an official basis, the most frequent place is a traffic stop. And here's an opportunity to know about that, and they don't have any data. They don't collect anything about that. So those are places that we've worked or are working. And what we do is, like I said, try to get some measure of drivers, this estimated population. But somebody else came up with this great idea. And it is that people who get accidents on your roads tend to look like the people who drive on your roads. Particularly two-car accidents. One-car accidents are sometimes affected by socioeconomic class and people who have bad cars and they drive them off the road. But two-car accidents are less likely to have that. So one of the estimates we found most effective is driving accidents. If you take the number of driving accidents in an area, it reflects the population. And remember, the population on our roads changes during the day, it changes at night, It changes on weekends, it changes all the time. So you know how we figured that out? We took 4 communities in Rhode Island, and we took Northeastern students, and we stood them out on the roads. Yeah, you got it. And they watched and did check marks for everybody that drove by and what their race was. And then we tested them with our driving population estimate, and we tested them with traffic accidents, and the traffic accidents were better. And these observation methods are the best.
I was wondering about how you're collecting race data that's not self-reported.
So it's great. It's a great question. It's not a plant. I didn't ask Emily to do that beforehand. Every time I'm training police officers, I have a group of police officers who don't want to do this, right? Who don't want to collect data, who don't. All I can think is they think they're doing it, right? But they are afraid. Like, I don't want to do this. So they say, how am I going to know what someone's race is? And I said, well, you know what? It really doesn't matter what the person's race is. The only thing that matters is what you think the person's race is. Because you're making a decision to stop the car, search the car, give a citation based on what your perception is. Not on whether the person self-identifies as 3 generations ago was this or that.
Kind of on that note, are there studies or thought about using like biometrics or testing the police officers who are more advanced implicit bias than the ones that are out there, so maybe virtual reality, where you can tap into presence and understand like their subconscious?
Yeah, there's some, there's the explicit aptitude test that we do. Now, there's some more sophisticated ones of those, but we do those with police. You have to sort of do it in the context of police. We have a great video that we use, which is a shoot, don't shoot video, which is you put the police in the machine and they have a gun and somebody jumps up and they shoot. And I know you're going to be really hard to believe, but they're more quick to shoot African American and Latino people with a soda can than they are white people or Asian people with a soda can. But the way you flip it, so they have to pay attention, is to say, but you know what? The white guy that pulls up with the gun, he killed you because you were waiting because you don't believe he's going to have a gun. So it works both ways, right? You're going to shoot somebody too quickly, but you're also not going to shoot to protect yourself. And so this person can react that way. So it is the case that that kind of stuff is important. And what I've found about implicit bias is that people can change, but you got to give them the data. You got to show them what they're doing. If they're not going to change just because you told them somebody does it, it's not them, it's everybody else. But if you say to them, okay, I'm going to look at who you stopped every week, for the next 2 years, and if it goes up, we're going to have a discussion. They can change their behavior. And so that's one of the things that happen. The other things that and if you talk to police, they're going to tell you that citations, that they can't tell who's driving the car, and I'm sure that's right sometimes at night, in the rain, in the snow, when they have a radar, they don't know who's driving the car. But once they stop the car, they know. They've gone up to you, they have a driver's license in their hand, they've had a conversation with you, they've made a judgment now about who you are. So what we call post-stop, which is citations to warnings, who gets a citation, who gets a warning, compare searches, who gets searched, who doesn't, hit rates, which is who do you find stuff on, and just suspend any anxiety. Whites get warnings, African Americans, Latinos get citations, African Americans, Latinos get searched, and whites find contraband on them more than African Americans, Latinos. But to give you an example, so this is Vermont, and you can see this is who they stopped, and you can see the numbers are small. It's 2% versus 1%, but African Americans were twice as likely to be stopped by the Vermont State Police. Asians about the same. This one happened to have a difference in Hispanic, Latino. Most of the studies look more like African Americans, and they have a small Native American population. But this is the kind of thing when you compare it to an adjusted population measure, that's what we tried to do, and we saw that there was a consistent pattern. We've seen that over time. is Rhode Island. And what this does is gives you an estimate of the driving population, because they don't collect race in Rhode Island on their traffic stops, on their traffic accidents, so we couldn't use that as a basis. But so what you would have is the estimate we had of the white population was 32% in Providence. You see that on the top row? 55.1% non-white population, and their disparity was 22%. They had 22% more non-white stops than we would have expected by our estimate of their population. And when we showed that to Providence, they said we were wrong. So that can't be right. So we did this study in 2004, then we did it again in 2014, 10 years later, and Providence hadn't learned anything. Sorry. Some other communities got better, but Providence didn't. But you can see that there's ways to do this and to go through it. What we tend to find is that in the decision to stop a car, the research is very mixed. It isn't consistent that race is a factor. In all of those post-stop decisions, it's always consistent that race is a factor. And to go back to Emily's question, police will say, well, I'm going to ask you at the car. I'm going to ask him because I don't know what the person's race is, and I don't want to be wrong, so I'm going to ask him. And we say, okay, let's play this little scenario out. I just pulled you over, license and registration, and can you tell me what your race is, sir? Is that going to make this interaction you're going to have with the public here very good? And you think they might say, why are you going to do this? It's fascinating. The community wants so little, and the cops are still afraid. When I had a chance to work with the NAACP on one of the things that happens in racial profiling is, some of you, no one in here would have ever done this, but some people have. You pull over a person of color and they say, you just pulled me over because I'm black. That's the first thing they say when the officer comes up to the car. Now, that may be true. That may not be true. I went to the NAACP, I said, you know, what should we tell cops to do in that situation? And they said, say the following. That may have happened to you in the past, but I'm pulling you over because you're going 55 in a 35-mile-an-hour zone. As opposed to being defensive, as opposed to being negative, acknowledge that may have happened. It wasn't in you. It could have happened in another jurisdiction. It could have happened. It could have happened lots of times. But factually, I'm telling you this is what I'm doing right now. If you can't tell him, then give him back his license and go and send him on his way. But that's sort of the recommendation. And when you tell police that, they are, absolutely, oh, that's all?
Do you have data on whether a white officer and a black officer react differently to a stop of a white person and a black person?
It's one of the things that was the most hopeful as we started to diversify our police departments is we got officers of color in there, that they would change the culture, and they have. But it's much more complex than that. The one saying in the field is that you're not black, you're not white, you're blue. You conform to the norms of the organization that you're in. It's too much to ask for one officer, the one African-American officer in a department, or the two African-American officers in the department, to stand up to the 30 peers that they have and say you're doing it wrong. That's a burden that people shouldn't have to have. So if you're looking at the data and you could show it to them, then you could support their action.
Kind of on the words of the recommendation of what to say, is it also was talking about how you say it, so like tone and like the respect part?
Yeah. The new thing newest understanding of in policing is called procedural justice. And what it does is it says, if you treat people just in an interaction, then they're going to come away from that feeling much better about that interaction. It's complicated. No, it's not complicated, it just means being nice. But it's complicated how to measure it. But basically what it means is that we have two traffic stops. And you ask people afterwards, were you satisfied with the way you were treated? What determines whether you're satisfied? What? It's whether you got a ticket, right? If you got a ticket, you're very unsatisfied, and if you got a warning, you're very satisfied. But then, if you treat people differently, and by that I mean you do 4 things, if I remember all 4. You explain to people what they're being pulled over for. You tell people what's going to happen next. You know, this is going to go to court, you'll get a summons, you'll have to pay this, whatever. You ask them if they have any questions. You answer their questions, and then you make sure that they get on their way as quickly as possible. If you do those things, this big difference over the ticket versus the warning becomes much closer. Doesn't get all go away, but it becomes much closer. Because people say, he or she treated me well. They asked me what I wanted to say, and they listen. You know?
Do you use body camera data, like video analytics for that?
Yeah, you can. We'll get to that a little bit. So I said that the decisions, these are the places that you do find huge variation across all of the decisions. And searching people is one of the most difficult things. And it's complicated. But here you go. If you decide that I'm going to search you, that's really embarrassing, right? They take you out of the car, they pat you down, they go into your pockets, all of those things. They have been known in this town, before some of your time, to strip search people on the street after the Charles Stewart murder. But that's a long process. When they do that to you and they don't find anything, what do? You go home and tell your friends and your family, I was just stopped for no reason. They searched me. I'm late. I'm embarrassed. Somebody drove by and saw me being searched, and I didn't do anything wrong. And if police want to have respect from the communities that they police, those are the kind of things that you can't do. So the search rate hits at about 15% of the time. That means 85% of the searches you're creating bad faith with your community. And a bunch of those searches are getting a nip out of someone's pocket or a marijuana joint. Is it worth it? Now, the interesting thing from a police dynamic, from a police officer's point of view, is the police never go back to the station at the end of the shift and say, wow, I searched 22 people tonight and didn't find a thing. They never say that. But if they find a gun, they're a hero. I got a gun off the street. And so the only thing they ever talk about are the searches that are positive, where they get the gun, and everybody's thinking like, yeah, I'm going to get a gun. I'll search. And their implicit biases trigger in, and they get to there. So that's one of the things that we did. So let me, I'm talking too long, but let me go down to the cameras, and then I'll come back to hate crime if you'd like. I have guns too. Not literally. Although, I have great stories. So, when I started in 1977 teaching here, I had a young female sergeant from the Boston Police Department used to come to my classes. And she would do a shoot, don't shoot drill. And the students could do that and decide who they were shooting by race. Now, in the early 1980s, think about this now. This is amazing. She came to my class with a gun loaded with blanks. A gun. And the kids got to shoot the gun at the video. Honest to God. They shot the gun at the video. And, you know, I had long lines of waiting lists to get in my class. I'm going to shoot guns at the video. But, you know, that was, now, that female police officer who was incredibly, you know, innovative, her name is Kathy O'Toole, and she became the Boston Police Commissioner, and then went on to be the police commissioner in Seattle, and was also the commissioner for the Irish police in Ireland, the Garda. So, she seems to have done okay. In September of 2016, we were approached, Anthony Braga, from the director of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice here, and I were approached by the Boston Police Department and said, the community wants body cameras, and we aren't sure if they're worth it. One of the things the commissioner said to me, and he was being really honest, he said, I think that everything that happens in the city is already on camera. Between the cameras the police department has, the cameras that every business has, the cameras that we all have on our phones, that everything seems to be on camera anyway. And whenever he gets a shooting, he always finds video. So he's saying, is this going to be worth millions of dollars to buy these cameras if we already have cameras? So Anthony and I were like, well, we can tell you. We can do a pilot, we can tell you, but the best way to do it would be a random control trial. And so that means, you know, like you do in drug studies, you know, one person gets the treatment and one person gets a placebo, and you watch them and see how they react to it. Same kind of thing here. We're going to give one officer a camera, and another officer matched with that officer and not a camera, and we're going to see if there's any difference. So we said, let's do that. And I don't want to show any bias here, but the Boston Police Union said, hell no. We're not going to do that. And so they went to court and said, making us wear cameras is a change in working conditions, and that means it's a collective bargaining decision, so we have to bargain that at the bargaining table. It took probably 9 months, but the court agreed with the police commissioner that it wasn't a change in working conditions, and wearing a camera was just like wearing a mace or a radio. And so they let the thing go forward, and we were able to do the random control trial. When we were playing with the union and trying to get them to play nice, we said to them, we'll do volunteers. You know, if you want to wear a camera, you could be a volunteer. That screwed up our random control trial, but we were just trying to get them out there. But the problem is that we asked for volunteers, and we were going to pay them $500. The department was going to pay them $500 to wear the camera for 6 months. And Boston has 2,100 officers, and not one volunteered. Not one. I know they can make money in overtime, but I thought, you know. So we eventually got this we matched officers by years of service, rank, district, everything, and I found 100 officers who would wear the cameras and 100 officers that were similar to them who didn't. So we had those two comparisons in the same districts, and then we had districts matched, so that one district compared to another, the cameras were in one district and not in another district. So we had that match. So we could look at both of those. We were going to do it originally 6 months, but it took, this may seem hard for some of you to believe, but Boston is a place that the police don't use force very much compared to other big cities. And there aren't many complaints against the Boston Police Department. So those social scientists of you out there, our base rate was way too low. We didn't have enough to be able to make a conclusion, so we asked them to extend it 6 more months, and they said they would. So we ended up with 38,000 videos. I didn't look at all of those. That would have made me crazy. But I looked at a lot of them. And 4,600 hours of video after the pilot. You know, a whole bunch of things happened that was interesting. Police officers said that they felt like they couldn't give people discretion. They wouldn't give people a break. Because someone would look over their videos and say, you know, this person was speeding and you didn't give him a ticket. Or this person was, you know, had marijuana and you just threw it away. And they said they felt that they couldn't do that because it was going to go to court and they would get disciplined by their supervisor. That didn't happen at all. But there was that fear. The bigger challenge with the cameras is us. I'll talk about this a bit, but one I always remember. So police officer gets out of his cruiser. There's a call for a disturbance at a laundromat. And he walks in, very polite, his camera's on, and he says, "Where's the manager?" And they said, "The manager's in the back." So he just goes down to the back. In the meantime, he's videoing all these families who are there doing their laundry. They didn't ask to be on video. Some of their kids are acting up. Who knows what they're doing, right? And they're all there. And he gets to the back, and the guy says to him, somebody's machine jammed, and he kicked the machine until he broke the glass, and he's gone. Okay. Do you have a description? I'll go try to see if we can find him. But then as he walks back, everybody else is back on the video again. And so there's a privacy issue with these that's really big. And I can tell you, as an example, when the governor's son was arrested, remember, on the plane thing, I promise you that if we had videos across the state, the first thing every TV station would have done is to FOIA every arrest or interaction between that governor, the governor's son, and any police department, and put it on television. And I think we have to think that through, because it really is the case. The other part of it that is difficult for me as a criminologist is, those are the innocent people that are in there, but the people that are under investigation are at one of the low points in their lives. If you think of anyone who's about to be arrested or is about to be questioned about a crime, they tend to be at a place where I don't want my kids to see me like that. You know, I don't, you know, maybe I give up that right if I've done something wrong, but still, as a society, I wonder how much of that we want to show. People are frequently on drugs or haven't been drinking. They're down on their luck. They're pretty silly, you know. We had a case of one of the videos of a guy in CBS, and a woman clerk calls the police come in, and she says, "This guy is shoplifting." And so the police officer goes up to her and says, you know, "Could you show me what's in his pockets?" And he starts emptying his pockets, and he's got, I don't know, 1,000 bottles of stuff in his pockets, right? And he says, "Oh, okay. Could you show me how you're going to pay for it?" He says, "Well, I don't have any money." So, "Well, what are you going to do?" He said, "I'm going to go home and get money and come back." Unlikely. So during this video, though, then there's this poor guy. She starts waving, the clerk starts waving like this, and says to the points to the cop, "Down here." Goes down one of the aisles, and this guy, and he's got a little gym bag, and he's sweeping every one of the aisles into the gym bag, you know? It's falling all over the floor and stuff. And he goes, the police goes, "Could you tell me what you're doing, sir?" He goes, "Whoa." I don't know. I don't think it was ideal. But, you know, so I think that we have to think about how we're going to use the videos. Because it is really an invasion of privacy that we're not used to. So, we looked at those two comparisons. The cops who had videos versus cops who were like them but didn't have videos in the same areas. And then the two areas that had videos and didn't have videos. And here's what we found. And it's pretty important. That the police officers, the conclusion we wrote was the police officers generate small but meaningful benefits to the civility of police-citizen encounters in Boston. And what we mean by that is the officers who had cameras had fewer complaints against them, and they used force less often compared to their prior use of force and compared to the individuals they were matched with. Now, the differences were very small. So, you know, this isn't robust from that point of view, but it was statistically significant. So, one of the things, as I said, Boston doesn't have a lot of complaints, and they don't use force very often. I worked in Austin, Texas. Those guys use force every day. Boston's different. The other thing that we found was that one of the questions was, if we put cameras on people, will they just stop doing work? It's called depolicing. They just say, I'm not going to do this anymore. If you're going to watch me, I'm not doing what you tell me to do. And we didn't see that that was changed. In other words, the same amount of activity they did before the cameras, they did after the cameras. And there's a thing they do in Boston, a lot of cities do it, called Field Interrogation and Observation, FIL reports. You may have heard about it. The ACLU did a report. Anthony Braga did a report on it. And you start to see that the police do file these reports on people of color more. The police explanation for this is they use them to document gangs. The community's response is that there are people in that database that aren't gang members. And so you go back and forth. But the cameras didn't change what they were doing in that regard. In other words, they continue to do what they had been doing similarly during the process. We did a series of community meetings around the community and tried to say, what is it that individuals felt about the cameras, and they were incredibly supportive of the cameras. The community members thought that this was a really good thing overall. It would make them safer. It would make the police behave better. By the way, the only case where something in the department was changed was a complaint against a police officer that they had the video and the complaint was false. But they had the video, so they did that. The privacy, like I talked about before, is a big issue, and how we all want our privacy. You can blur the faces of people. That gets very expensive, even with technology. It tends to become, you have to go through and look at it anyway to see who you're blurring, who you're not. But it is an incredible training tool, because you get a chance to show officers what they're doing wrong. So you can tell them. We had done it in Rhode Island with in-car videos one time, and when you watch the videos, you know, cops are like all of us. They take shortcuts, they get lazy. So they would go up to the car, and they'd walk up in front of the car to give a ticket. And, you know, if you think about that, that puts them pretty in a vulnerable spot. All I have to do is step on the gas, and you're done. They teach police, a little trade secret, the police are supposed to stand behind you by the front window. So if you've ever been stopped, you're like, why are you back there? But the reason they do that is because if you take a gun out, that gives them a half a second more to see the gun come across your body and to have to point it backwards. If you're right here, you can just do this. But if you're back here, then you have a better chance of surviving that incident. So they do teach you that and teach you how to survive those. And unfortunately, we have situations every year where police officers are shot in car stops. So it's something that we have to deal with. But this is one of those interesting things where you try to get individuals to understand how they're doing things and how they do them well or ill. Go back to your respectful policing thing. The biggest change that the police commissioner found compared to all the other videos, you've seen the videos of police shooting, you know, African Americans mostly. One thing that's amazing about them, because they're shot from cameras that are outside, is you never hear the sound. Here you hear the sound. And that's a huge difference. Because you can hear who's saying what to whom, who's using what tone of voice, you know, who's being respectful, who's not. And it changes your whole understanding of the situation. Because you can hear how someone's speaking to the officer, how this officer is speaking back to that person. It's a huge part of this process. And it gives you a lot more context to this than just seeing it from across the street from one lens in a thing that's on the other side of town.
Question.
Yes?
What about then, instead of video, having like tone analysis, so that way you could analyze if people are being respectful without violating privacy?
there's a company in Cambridge that offered to do that. There's a lot of challenges with that, but they can do some kinds of tone analysis, voice analysis. I think that's becoming more accurate. But you're right. I mean, we could do a lot more with this now. I mean, I just want to turn the damn cameras on. but if we can learn more, that would be great. So, you know, one of the things we did was we had students watch these videos. And the cameras are really good. Again, back to your technology, the cameras work in the rain, they work at night, they work in the snow. They don't, the way the Boston Police wore them, which I think is a good idea, was the camera was affixed to their uniform right here. So the light came on so you knew you were on camera. They announced it too, not always, but more often than not. We're filming you. But one of the things that happens is, you gotta always remember, it's not like a TV movie, right? Here's the camera. So if I'm talking to you and someone says to me, let that boy alone, right? Now I'm talking to this person, and I don't see what's going on here, right? It's a camera that's right affixed to this, so wherever I face, you're going to get that video. You're not going to get a panoramic view or another view. So you can, it was one of the things. Now, one of the problems is, if you're a police officer, and this doesn't happen very often, this is more TV than real life, but in real life it happens occasionally, and you get into a fight with someone, it's pretty easy to tear off the camera. And they tend to get torn off. So then you don't see them anymore. But, you know, it doesn't happen all that often. But they do offer a really important, high-quality video of what happened in the experience. The other piece of it that's interesting is that, remember, most police come to a crime after the crime was committed. You go home, your house has been robbed, you call the police. At the time the police come, okay, they're going to secure your house, help you make sure that you lost anything. But you're not going to see the robber because they robbed them, you know, sometimes 6 hours ago while you were at work, right? So you do get to see the interaction, but you don't necessarily get to see the crime, and that's important. The one thing that was really interesting about this was that the police were going to be wearing the cameras. The lawsuit was for the police to wear the cameras. The fight was around the police wearing the cameras. And I was doing one community meeting. I'm sorry, driving you crazy here. I was doing one community meeting, and there were 2 local prosecutors there, district attorneys. And they said, you know, these cameras are really important to us. And I was like, excuse me? And they said, these are huge in court. And I know no one thought of the impact on the court system of how these cameras, you know, the debate was, should the police have them, shouldn't the police have them, should police commit acts of misconduct and violence, won't we get them on tape, da-da-da-da-da. Nobody thought about how the implications are for the court system. But what the judges, prosecutors, I went to the defense counsel, and the defense counsel, I met with them, and they said, we want the cameras too, because they show our clients are innocent. And the prosecution said, we want the cameras because they show our clients are guilty. You both want? But what they said is that with juries, they're almost always determinative. What shows on the camera is what the jury's going to decide. And with judges, they're very often what's going to decide the case. So there's Rachel Rollins, who's going in as a new district attorney, is going to have a huge issue with trying to understand how this stuff plays in court, because they have, this is, you know, the CSI effect, they call it, that everybody wants to see, you know, somebody come in and look for blood splatter and fingernail droppings and all of this, and it doesn't happen. But juries want that. And here, if we start to have an expectation that there's going to be a video, The one thing that I'm absolutely sure of, and they all said it, everyone agreed, is if there isn't a video in a case, the court is going to believe that that was an intentional omission by the officer. So the officer either destroyed the video or failed to turn it on because she knew she was going to act badly, and therefore that will be prejudicial in a court case. I don't know how it's played out, but that's what they're going to believe. And it doesn't strike me as being too far out of bounds.
Can you get witnesses, kind of, from the officer coming on the scene of an active, not a robbery in your house, but something that's active? If
You-
it just turns around and pans the audience.
You could. We have to keep thinking about trade-offs, right?
Yeah.
You could, let's say we're talking about a horrendous murder in Boston, an innocent person is shot. You go ahead and pan the crowd, and you have all those faces. You could ask people to identify these people and reach out and see if they had anything. I mean, that's basically what you do now in canvassing. You go to the people who you see at the scene of the crime. Did you see anything? Was anyone else here that you... So this would be a way to facilitate that. The challenge becomes facial recognition, which is really good. We could probably identify them with that. We don't have that in the city right now, but that doesn't mean it won't be there quickly. You know, it starts us down a slope of technology and confidentiality that is challenging. We're gonna all have to face it and make decisions that way, but I would like to be able to have a group such as yourselves who are unbiased trying to say what would be the best way to do this, because it is the case that it's difficult to balance, you know, the need to get someone who's going to hurt somebody in the community, and we want to stop them from hurting people. At the same time, we don't want to infringe on people's liberties. If you think of a car stop, now none of this would happen to any of you, but people have been known to be in cars with people that they're not happy to be seen with. Sometimes they may not be a spouse but they're there. You know, sometimes they may be somebody who's involved in criminal activity. There's a whole variety of things, but that isn't something that, think about it in divorce proceedings. If every time somebody was stopped, they could go and look at who was in the car with them. This is a slippery slope that we're starting down, and we have to understand how to deal with it. Because the technology is way ahead of our ability to think through what are the negative implications of the technology.
Besides that, do you think that the consequences for misconduct is stringent? You would say because, like, for example, Officer Roman that shot Myra,
Yeah.
he was fired, but then he was hired by another police
Yeah.
department. Don't you think that's another way of like fixing it, the underlying issue, from the, to lower the numbers in misconduct? You know, you get fired by one, you get 90 days paid leave, like, and then you can go move to Kentucky and be hired by,
Yeah.
any municipal police department.
Yeah, I mean,
how can we fix that?
I mean, he's a criminal. He should be in jail, and he shouldn't be being hired by a different police department. This is the Tamir Rice case, which was in
Yeah.
Cleveland, right?
Cleveland,
And he was a 12-year-old kid that had to play gun, remember? And the police officer got out of his car, and the challenge here is, I could see, although it's hard, I could see a situation where the police officer may have thought it was a real gun,
In an open
but in an open carry state.
and they said he was a
Just as a point of information, I'll come back to this. I told you I'm working in Kansas. At KU, you can bring guns onto campus. It's an open carry state. You can carry them onto campus. They tell you can't bring them into a classroom, but how would you know? You can bring them to the cafeteria. You can bring guns anywhere. It's like, oh my God, people are walking around with guns everywhere. But in the Tamir Rice thing, what happens is he gets out of the car and in something like 8 seconds shoots this 12-year-old boy.
Shouldn't you ask questions?
You should be,
Coach nicely?
right. Now, I know that people get negative when we give credit to the Boston Police Department, and they have all their flaws. But to give you one set of how to juxtapose that, In Boston, at the academy, they show everybody a case, and they work it through. And it's a case that happened in Mattapan, and a man had a samurai sword. You know, the big one like you see on TV, you know? And he was in the parking lot, and he was waving it at people. He didn't cut anybody, he's waving it at people. They call the police come. Police say, okay, you know, put the knife down. No. Put the knife down. The guy says, shoot me. You know, murder by cop, right? He says, shoot me, shoot me. He's waving the knife. They say no. He comes at them with this big knife. And the two police officers there step around their cruiser and stand there. Now, he can't stab them over the cruiser, right? I mean, they have a barrier. I mean, they're standing here, right? He's over there, and they're just like, have a good day, you know? So they talked to him for about 20 minutes, and eventually he put the knife down, and they arrested him. And he went to a psychiatric hospital because he was obviously having some kind of an event. But they show that in the academy. This is the way we want you to act as police officers. We want you to be creative and not use force. In other police academies, they would say, that's a justified use of force. He's coming at you with a knife, he could kill you, shoot. So the way we train police is very different in different parts of the country and different kinds of administrations. So it's one of those things that we could think about how to do better.
I have a question now. So we're seeing that they use less force in Boston,
Yep.
but have the body cameras help with racial profiling in the sense of there's less racial profiling, or there's a black man that committed a murder in a town over, but now we're stopping every single black man before we actually get to that town. So has it helped mitigate some of those things?
The cameras, there was only 100 officers out of 2,100. So whether or not it's going to do it across the whole department when it becomes the case, they haven't rolled it out. The mayor put $2 million in the budget to buy cameras, which was really good. The union has said that they're going to fight it in court because they believe that they should be paid extra to wear cameras. So, it's stalled right now. But when we get it out there, I do think that there's a training opportunity there that will allow people to understand better how they treat different people. And I'll make the hairs on your back of your neck stand up in a second. We're trying to build a curriculum here with Myra, who's a law professor, to try to deal with some of these issues. And one of the ways we're doing it is to look at, she's been working with families who have family members who were lynched, African-American people in the South who had family members who were lynched. And she's identified historic patterns of trauma that get passed down from generation to generation based on that lynching. And we're going to use that to build a curriculum for police officers to show why some people act the way they do to the police without them having done anything to that individual person. And what Margaret has asked me to help her with that, and I'm happy to do that. We went to a conference together with these families. And this is the hair thing. So an incredibly articulate young man was talking about his family. And he said that his great-grandfather had been lynched. It was in Georgia, I believe. And anyway, he had become a free man. He was a slave. He became a free man. He bought land. Former slave owning land was a threat. It was an allegation that he had raped a white woman. He was put in jail. A mob came to the jail. They lynched him on a tree just outside of town. They then went, the people who lynched him, he had 11 kids, 7 boys. And they took the 7 boys, and they brought him out, the boys out to the body. And they said to the boys 2 things. You have a week to get out of town, and the family moved to Chicago. It has never been back. And you can never have children. And this kid said none of his uncles has ever had a child. So you think through what those stories do to a community. And that police have to understand that they own that when they're interacting with people. They didn't do it, but that's part of the history that people have and how this works. And so trying to think of how we can teach police about this is really important. And there's a group in Brookline that some of you know, Facing History and Ourselves, and they use the Holocaust to teach about bystanders and not doing the lack of bystanders. And we want to use this as a way to sort of say how intergenerational trauma goes down from one generation to the next, and teach about that.
You want to sit?
No, it's up to you. You have a question?
Boston, to me, Boston seems unique in that there are so many college, private armed forces, or police forces.
Yep.
And do you include them in your research, or do you have an understanding of their impact on the community, especially if they are armed?
Yeah, I mean, we try to. Like I said, in the Kansas one, we have Kansas University. But lots of particularly private universities don't want to play. So, I mean, you think to yourself, it's crazy, the jurisdictional thing. When I teach my intro class, I'll say, if you start over at International Village over here, and you walk over to BU, okay, you're at Northeastern's property, then you're policed by the MBTA police when you're going through Ruggles, then you get out to, what is it? Parker Street, and you're back to the Boston police. You cross the tracks, you're on the MBTA police. As you're going through the Fenway, you're on the state police. Then you cross over again and you're back to Boston police. You've walked less than a mile and you've crossed like 6 jurisdictions of police. How are you supposed to know? It's crazy. But we're a small, we're a tiny little community, 48 square miles, and we have, Massachusetts has 350 police departments. It's nuts. And we have dozens here in the city, with school police and different kinds of police departments. So it does become, and they're less interested in this sometimes.
How's Northeastern? They give us data?
Yeah, they do give us data. They're okay. They're okay.
What's your opinion on the preliminary interview for cops joining the force? Do you think it's, again, strictly enforced? Because some states require polygraph, and some require psychological testing, but then in some states like, I think it's Cleveland, like they said, Loman, he asks a doctor to sign off on the psychological exam, but a doctor is not a psychologist.
Right. So, I mean, I think that
they're enforcing.
you remember when you're hiring a cop, you're usually hiring an 18, 19-year-old kid who hasn't had much history. We give them lots of those tests. It's not, I'm less concerned about the tests going in than the culture that allows them to have bad traits and supports them. You go to the academy, you teach them in the academy, and then we have a field training officer, and the first thing they say is, kid, forget everything you learned in the academy, I'll teach you what it's really like to be a cop.
But there are those who are coming from the army that have PTSD.
And one of the things that was the biggest frustration to the previous commissioner, I think it is for this commissioner, but I've been friends with most of the Boston Police Commissioners, and Billy Evans drove him crazy that the veterans got an absolute preference.
Wow.
So they bumped everybody down the list. And he didn't want veterans. Because when you're trained in the military, you're trained for one kind of thing, which isn't problem solving in a community, it's to go to war. And we want to train them to go to war because they're protecting us. But they shouldn't be in our streets. And so to untrain them for that and try to train them to be police, obviously some are wonderful, but it's a challenge. So it's right.
Do you also train, or are police trained to understand when they pull and stop someone over, especially a person of color, like their stress levels also go up and their anxieties, and that they also may fear police officers too? Because when I get stopped, like my anxiety goes through the roof, and then I don't know, I actually fear for my life when I get stopped.
Yep.
Maybe it's valid, maybe it's not, but like those are the natural feelings that I
right now, but as he gets to Mara Rice's age and older, he's going to become a threat based off of people's natural bias.
Yep.
And I think it's important that people not in the culture understand that these are real fears that we have.
Yep.
And that everyone, because of our color, of our skin, we're not, you know, a threat. And I mean, it's just really wild for me, and that people still believe this. And I mean, it's really hard for me to grapple where we're at right now in 2019.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And people of color, a number of you know this, have been having the talk with their kids when they start to drive for decades. If you get pulled over, this is how you behave. And you know, if you're 15, 16 years old, you don't want to behave. You want to get in the cop's face and tell him this wasn't fair, what you did to me. You know, when my 16-year-old son got pulled over, he was like, why did you do this? You know, but that you can't let your child do that because there's a possibility that the cop's going to overreact and something bad could happen. Now, as a social scientist, I'll tell you the probability is rare. But I can't tell you the probability is zero. So as a good parent, you have to protect your child the way you can. And I would say that still is something that's real today. And unfortunately, it's something that you have to sort of come to grips with. You want to balance it with the fact that you want your child to go to the police if they ever are in need and to be able to have the police help them. And the vast majority of the time they will. But there's a reality there that there are some police officers out there that are racist. And that is something that we have to deal with.
We will have the police commissioner in later this semester in several classes, and I would strongly encourage you to repeat what you had to say when he's here, along with our head of criminal justice. You want to have a seat? Why don't we give you a chance to do that? You didn't get to two of your subjects.
I know.
But I think people have both specific and general questions, and let's really throw it open for questions at this point. I would also ask, as among the two subjects you didn't get to deal with, and since the rest of the program is already booked at this point, were there particular takeaways that you wanted to exchange about those other subjects, either about guns or other stuff? And then we really want to throw it open.
Two things, one on hate crime and one on guns. The hate crime takeaway is that there has been an increase. It's measured nationally, it's measured in Massachusetts, it's been measured in other states, and unfortunately the increase started with the presidential election and the coarseness of the language and the way that we talked about other groups and the way we characterize Mexicans or immigrants and all of that, and that has given there are some people out there who hate, and I've studied them my whole career, and they are looking for an excuse to act out. And if they think people won't care, they'll act out. And some of that is what's happening. They feel that people share their belief system, that if I drive this black family out of this neighborhood, or if I drive this undocumented person out of my workplace, nobody will care. And it's usually important that we challenge that myth. And we tell people that we do care. And it's wrong what they did. But it is that unfortunately, since the biggest increase in hate crimes in the history of the United States, they started collecting data in 1990, was 2001 in the aftermath of 9/11. And now we've been on a downward trend since then, and now it's turned around and come back up. So that is one of the things that is frightening. And I will say that I work with the FBI and I talk to them a lot about hate crimes and help with investigations and stuff. And the thing that scares me the most, and it's not happening yet, but I'm petrified of it, is for some reason, and Gordon has studied this, she knows it as well as I, the offenders in hate crimes don't use guns. They use hands, fists, rocks. The psychologists who study it think they want to be close to their victim because they're not human and they want to watch them suffer, and well, I don't understand that, but that's what they're told. But we've now seen, it's not a trend, but we've seen a few high-profile incidents in California, and the most recent one in Pittsburgh in the Temple, where somebody went in and shot people. And think about it, if you can drive by a church, a mosque, a temple, a park, school, and fire into that and get people who you hate, that will change the character of hate crimes in the United States. So if we start see that happening, law enforcement has to be very, very, aware and respond very quickly to that. They have so far in those kind of things, but, that's one thing that scares me. And then on guns, I headed the Gun Violence Commission for the Speaker of the House in Massachusetts in 2014 after the killings in Newtown. And we made a bunch of changes to the law and were able to make it be more rational. And for those of you who study public policy, I'll just give you one quick example and we could throw it open to questions. We'd be on either of those topics as well. But when we started our study, we had a wonderful group of people who was a task force appointed by the state, and I was lucky enough to lead it. And we met for 8 months and we looked at all the legislation and everything. And because, you pass a law and then there are laws previous to that, and they don't always mesh, and they don't always go together. So Massachusetts had a law that said if you want to buy a rifle, you have to have an FID card, firearms identification card. And the firearms identification card was yours as a right if you weren't a federally prohibited person. And I won't bore you with all that, but as a convicted felon, a person who'd been involuntarily incarcerated in a mental institution, it's a very small group of people that can't buy a gun. So a few years later, in 1975, Massachusetts passed a second law that said if you want to get a handgun, and you want a license to carry that gun, you have to go to your local police chief, and she has to give it to you. And there's discretion there. It's not just the police chief can look at other things about your background and decide you're not a person that should have a handgun. And so basically what we started with was a situation where somebody could go to their police department, ask for a handgun, be turned down for something like a domestic violence case, but there wasn't an arrest and there wasn't a restraining order, but the police have been to the house 3 times for violence. The police know that and say, I'm not giving you a gun. But the person could, the next day, go buy a rifle because they hadn't been arrested. It made no sense. And so we recommended that they be on the same standard, the higher standard of the police. And we got, it passed the legislature by 1 vote. By 1 vote. But it did pass. And so it is the kind of thing that you shake your head and say, how does this is crazy, but it is the case that now in the state, we had I asked one of the police chiefs who he had turned down, and he said he turned down this one couple, and I thought, he said they were elderly. Like, well, what happened? He said, well, they had written a book about being abducted by aliens. So I sent one of my officers there to just check with them when they both wanted to buy guns. And he said, did you, you were writing this tongue-in-cheek, weren't you? And they were like, no, they were here last month. We went up last month. I said, no gun for you. But sometimes the local police have some local knowledge that can be helpful. But here's the bottom line, which is so important. The number of gun licenses that were turned down by the police jumped after we made this change to the law. It went from 2% of the gun license applications being turned down to 4% of the gun license applications. So 96% of the people who applied for guns got them. So it isn't like people were being denied whole stock. They weren't. There was just a small number of people who have a documented history of violence, and they didn't get their guns. So those were the other two takeaways from that.
So, let me start by asking a large question, then a small one. The larger one is that this course is about trying to create a just city, and you've been working in areas of criminal justice and race for a few decades. Without regard to the specific things you've talked about today, what are the kinds of things that you think would need to happen for racial inequalities to be reduced in terms of criminal justice and public safety?
That's a great question. And I think, you know, on the 50,000-foot level, it's around valuing each other and how we value and treat each other. But I will say that I believe in social science, and I believe in data, and I think that we all can be held accountable for our decisions, and having ways to measure and hold people accountable for their decisions. You know, implicit bias is a cruel thing, and it creeps into all of the ways we interact with each other. And as a college professor, it's something that I'm surprised when one of my Chinese students doesn't meet the expectation in class. There's all kinds of things that happen, and I think that we need to sort of have better, we now have data on all kinds of things. We need to have better data on the decisions we make and how they may be made differently.
Okay, and then the smaller thing is about just your reaction to an incident that took place earlier this week, which people who still look at newspapers would have seen, and I'm sure it struck you, but apparently there were two drivers on a major highway around here, and one of them sideswiped the other. And they stopped long enough for the two of them to exchange words. And one of the drivers, in a sense of road rage, jumped on the hood of the other driver's car. And the guy in the car drove off and drove down the highway, stopping and going, trying to shake the guy off the hood. And at times apparently reached speeds of 50 miles an hour and then would stop. Needless to say, some of the other drivers pulled out their cell phones and did videos of this. The guy on the hood called out to them to please call 911. So someone called 911. And then 4 cars, seeing what was going on over the few miles, boxed in the driver and the guy on the hood, forced them off the road, and got them to stop. One of the guys in the 4 cars was a Latino guy who got out of his car with a gun and told the driver of the car to get out of the car and get down on the ground in order to subdue him. At that point, the police arrived. And when the police arrived, seeing an Hispanic guy standing over a white guy on the ground holding a gun to him, the police, of course, said, well, we're going to arrest you, drop the gun. The Hispanic guy with the gun said, I have a license to carry, and the police said to him again, drop the gun, at which point the guy holding the gun put the gun down, and then the 2 other guys who had started the altercation were taken into custody. And I guess this morning, or yesterday morning, they pleaded not guilty. An extraordinary set of activities. I want your comment on all of that.
Well, it rightfully made the national news. It's not just the local news. And, there's so many thoughts about that. You know, one is, you never see women do that. This is boys will be boys. This is testosterone gone wild. You know, I mean, you wouldn't see women do that. You would see men do that. And, you know, oh, you hit my car. And you know, the two quick stories, as you could tell, I'm Irish Catholic. I teach by telling stories. So, Wellesley Police, a number of years ago, get a call that a person who robbed the bank last week is back in front of the bank sitting in the car. They arrive at the car, see an African-American man in it, pull their guns out, 6 cops. You don't have that many cops in Wellesley, but it was shift change, so they were all there. So 6 cops go up, pull him out of the car. He says, no, you don't understand, I'm D. Brown. And his white girlfriend gets out of the car and says, what are you doing? Are you crazy? Stop. And they put him down on the ground, face first on the ground, and they handcuff him. Now, you're all too young, but some of the older people here would understand. D. Brown was a Boston Celtic who had just been drafted and was trying to buy a house in Wellesley. He didn't later. But he was thinking of buying a house in Wellesley, and he bought a post office box, and he was looking at his mail. So he explained this situation to the police. Again, the situation is, you see a person of color, this time he's with a white woman, oh my God, in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And so it was immediately suspicious. And so then he shows them a letter welcoming him to the Boston Celtics signed by Red Auerbach, who was then the president of the Boston Celtics. And what did the police say? Oh shit. What do we do now? But they arrested him! They arrested him! And so you say to yourself, are they stupid? Yes. I mean, they weren't sure what to do. They didn't know how to save face. A whole bunch of this is about saving face. And they didn't know what to do, so they arrested him, brought him to the jail, and then called Red Auerbach, and Red Auerbach said, yes, he's a Boston Celtic. He's only 6 feet tall, but he's still a Boston Celtic. And they then released him. And he, you know, he was a wonderful man. It is a wonderful man, D. Brown, and he just had them do sensitivity training to get them to understand what it was. But, you know, this whole combination of things. The guy that was driving the car went 60 miles an hour in the example Ted had. I mean, he would have killed the person, you know. The other guy's hanging on the car like he's some kind of Rambo character from the movies. The whole thing doesn't make any sense. I think the Latino guy who came up with the gun was probably trying to defuse the situation. He didn't know if the driver was going to drive off again and run over and kill this guy. You know, it's probably a case of a civilian acting responsibly with a gun. But, you know, the police then assume he's the problem when they arrive on the scene because he's a Latino guy with a gun. It's a crazy, crazy situation. And I do think that it shows it illustrates a whole bunch of the things that are wrong with our system, you know, that we can't. One more story. So this past year, you probably heard about it. It was on TV. A police officer was driving his car, and again, this is a male thing. He's driving his car in Roxbury, I think. He made a turn, and a gentleman was out in the crosswalk, and he sort of drove by the person on the crosswalk, but he was close to the individual. And the individual in the crosswalk had an umbrella, and he hit the window of the car. And so the guy who's driving the car, who's an off-duty police officer, chases the guy down the street. Now the guy, they're both white. The guy who hit him, cop is this big guy. He works out. The other guy's like 65 years old, and you know he's running down the street. Cop jumps on him and leaves his car running and all of this. And so the police commissioner calls me in and says, "Would you look at the video?" And I look at it and I said, "You know,
he behaved badly, the cop. He said, well, he hit his car. Yeah. And he said to me, wouldn't you have chased somebody down if they hit your car? And I thought about it for a second and said, you know, I'm 65 years old, I got white hair, I'm not chasing anybody, but I wouldn't have chased him 20 years ago either. No, it wouldn't have occurred to me to chase somebody down. But, you know, it was a cop. So cops are trained that way, and they were like, yeah, they were all in this room, all the command staff. They're like, yeah, anybody would have chased this guy down. No! This is that culture thing again that I talked about. You got to get back to sort of saying to people, how do you treat people with respect? And how do you deal with things within the law and not create your own law?
Yeah, it's about the value of learning restraint. Questions or comments? Yeah, we've got a few. Let's start in the back and work our way down. Yes?
Okay. I'm not originally from this area. I'm a native Washingtonian of D.C. So my dialect is from there, but it's a bit combined since I'm up here in the Boston area. So my biggest problem is usually the expectation because of my features. I'm supposed to have accented English and I'm not supposed to be fluent. And then the other part is I catch the same thing from all other ethnic groups. I was told, and learned this from school, grammar school, mind you, when it comes to greeting someone before passing judgment on somebody, please say hello first. Listen to the way the person says hello. Then you can figure out whether it's accented English or they don't know English very well. But don't pass judgment until they say hello, because you never know when you've lost your best friend for life. And I still go through this since the time I was 5 and 6 years old. And it hasn't stopped. And it's shameful. I've caught it from every ethnic group that there is. I've had to learn to mentally block some of it out in order to get through things more civilly. It's not easy.
And we all carry the biases around with us, and they're biases that have to do with stereotypes we have in our head about who certain people are, and you know what we think is the reality of who they are. Those realities are formed in all kinds of weird ways. They don't represent the truth. They represent media depictions, Hollywood depictions, things we've heard from friends and family. You know, it is the case that that's a huge part of what drives us apart. And so I appreciate what you've been through.
Yeah. Working our way down, there were a couple of hands. Yeah, sir.
Yes, going back to the Turnpike, the Bass Pike incident, you know, when I saw that on TV and I see someone pulling a gun, regardless of who the person was, you know, what is your thought on just the idea of pulling a gun? I realize he tried to stop and prevent, but if the person decided to drive on or have the ability to drive on, what's he going to do? Is he going to shoot him? And so what are your thoughts, you know, on just the incident of just anyone pulling a gun in a situation like that?
It's a good question. I think that the guy had good intent. When I've seen the video, I don't think he intended to shoot anybody. I think he was afraid the guy was going to drive away. I don't want civilians pulling guns out in any situation. You know, none of us are trained. I don't want police officers pulling guns out. But, you know, I don't want civilians pulling guns out. I think that guns are dangerous, and, you know, all the data points to the fact that they're more dangerous to you to have a gun in your house than not, to your family. You know, so I do think that obviously there are some great people who have great values and are trained and work really hard and might be the right person in that situation, but, you know, another story. When the Boston Marathon bombing happened, they found Yokar Sanarov on the boat in Watertown. He was sitting on the gunwale of the boat at one point. He was moving back and forth. There was a state police helicopter with a light on him. Estimate about 150 police officers there, because they came on their own. They opened fire on him on the boat. They all missed him. They all missed. He had already been shot and he was bleeding from a previous shot. They didn't hit him. The only one they hit that time was another police officer that was hitting a car and almost bled out. So, you know, the Hollywood depiction of how we do with guns is so inaccurate. You know, if you're threatened in your life and you're trying to think of how to fire, you're not gonna, it's not like you're sitting on a range with your buddies, and it just is, it's not an effective, there are much more effective ways to deal with violence.
You've got better statistics on this, and maybe you can give me the right statistics, but when I ran the Safe Neighborhoods program for the city, I looked at a lot of data and training on firearms, and one of the things I came to understand is that the majority of people who own a firearm, right, are not necessarily, at least in this part of the world, they're not necessarily hunters. Right. Very few, in fact, virtually none of those gun owners have been through domestic training on how to use a firearm. That is to say, in Boston, you can get a license to carry, and you do have to go to a police range, and you do have to demonstrate that you can hit a target. But apart from that, and usually you have to go through some basic training about the gun itself in order to qualify for the license, but you don't get any training on how to actually use it. And so there's this perception that when the burglar comes into the house, and you hear the rustling downstairs, you're going to pull the Glock out from under your bed, and you're going to confront him from upstairs, and you're going to be calm enough at 2 in the morning to be able to put a bullet in his leg, right. So that you then have time to call the police to say, I have a wounded burglar in my foyer, right? Yep. But the fact is, most people never go through any training that indicates that they have any skill in terms of how to handle a gun in an emergency domestic situation. And the majority of gunshots, woundings, are of people shooting themselves. And that the leading cause of suicide, the leading device for suicide in the United States is a gun. So that having a gun in the house is more likely to lead to a suicide than it's likely to lead to home defense, where, as they show in all of the TV shows, you've actually protected your family. What are the hard numbers on that, and to what extent does that affect gun ownership?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's two suicides for every homicide in the United States. So every time you hear of a homicide, there are 2 suicides. The suicides are by gun. And as Ted's saying, you're 4 times more likely to have the gun used by a member of your family in an accident or suicide or a mistake than you are to use it against somebody who's an intruder. The idea that you're going to find the gun, get downstairs, all of that, shoot the person is a Hollywood fantasy. It's not reality. It's not something that anybody does. It is the case that Ted's painting a picture that's better than the real picture, because one of the things we put in the law and the NRA took out when we made the recommendation for the law was that you had to fire a gun in your class to be able to get a license. In other words, they require you to go to a class, but some classes is just a PowerPoint presentation. This is a gun, this is where the bullets go with God. That's what it is. They never touch a gun. And we give them a license. That's nuts. So, in Boston, they do have to go to a range and have a class at a range where you take the gun apart, put it back together, learn how to use the safety, those kind of things. But In a lot of communities, there's classes out there that are certified, and all you gotta do is sit through the 30-minute presentation about guns, and you have your gun. So, when we're talking about gun violence, unfortunately, there's so many guns out there that the idea of trying to find ways to get people to leave guns at home is really effective, because people get into the same arguments about whether it's the Los Angeles Rams or the Patriots and who should win Sunday. But if there's a gun there, it's just always the chance that it escalates into something much more dangerous. In 1975, when they changed the law, and that was where they put up, some of you remember this, they put up signs on all the ways into the state saying if you don't have a gun without a license, you have 1 year in jail. It was mandatory. And they did a big publicity campaign about it and everything. We did see people leaving their guns at home, and attacks with other weapons went up. They didn't bring knives, but they used beer bottles and chairs, and one of my favorites was a hot pizza. And it's hard to kill somebody with a hot pizza. You may hurt them, but it's hard to kill them. It's not so hard with a gun. Yeah? Did you?
Oh, I was just wondering, we've got a lot of different people here from everywhere, and their cultures are all mixed, and some would have more violence to them than others. How do you sort it all out so they don't all end in disaster, and the cops have some kind of rapport?
You mean different kinds of communities?
Yeah, different places from, I mean, Cape Verde versus Georgia versus Philippines, you know?
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I haven't had lots of individuals who come who don't, everyone seems to want the same thing, which is the ability to live their life by themselves and be successful and, you know, have a life for their family. That's sort of shared across everybody. But there are some cultural differences. And I'll give you an example. In Cameroon, their culture is that you carry your wallet in your sock. Okay? So you carry your wallet in your sock. Bear with me. This is interesting. And then the other cultural thing is that you would, if a police officer pulls you over, you go to the cruiser. A lot of countries are like this. They don't come to you, you go to them. So here, think about this. This is up in Lowell. Cop pulls somebody over. They get out of the car respectfully, head towards the cruiser, reach down to their ankle to get their wallet out, and they were going to get shot. And so they finally realized what was going on, and what happened was they went to the community and did some education about what the expectation is. You stay in the car here in the United States. But they also trained the police about, these people are trying to be respectful to you. They're trying to do what's right. And there is this, you have to understand this cultural competence. You have to understand how different people do things, because they do feel like, sometimes it looks like they're being a threat. And nobody got shot in that instance, but it was the case. There were some people that was very close, because the police officer's like, what is this person doing walking back to me with reaching down to their ankle? So you do find that. I mean, we have more in common than we do separately, but there are those instances where we have, you know, things that we have to deal with. And training's the issue.
Yeah, we've got a bunch of hands up here. Yeah.
So I would just like to get your thoughts about police officers who live outside of Boston that police our communities. Do you think if they lived in Boston, it would help mitigate some of the racial and cultural differences if they actually lived, so they were invested in the community, not like have like a 2 or 3 year requirement? Do you think that would be helpful?
Assuming they could afford to live here.
Right.
Right. Assuming with all the extra overtime.
Well, you probably won't like this, but I don't know that it's that important that they live in the community. Now, they have to live here to get on the job. You know that. Like, they can't be living in Newton and apply and no. Or they can't do what they do in a lot of communities and just say they'll move in afterwards. They can't. They have to be living here. And then they get on. But, you know, if you look outside the city, you know, no police officers live in Weston, or Dover, or Wellesley. They can't afford it. And they know their community, and they police it, and all of those things. But, you know, I think that if you're there and you care about the people that you're working with, that's the number one thing. Obviously, if you have one of the things that the MBTA has a big problem with is they hire people from the statewide. So they can hire somebody from East Longmeadow, which is the example, all white, and then they put him on the T and he works in Dorchester. And they're scared to death. And they don't know how to handle it. That's a different question. But, you know, if you have an urban person who grew up in Quincy, could they police in Boston? I think they can. But they have to care about the city and have to care about the people that are in the city. And, you know, I don't think, I mean, there are negative sides to having a cop in your community too, you know. Your kid's having a party and he's across the street and all of a sudden, oh dear. So it's a complicated one. I know what you're saying is that they should be vested in the community. They could still do that in other ways too.
In the back?
I'm from Boston, and I got the opportunity to work with Boston Police, and I feel like, as a comment, our police force is very unique, and I actually got to do the Junior Police Academy, and just to see how they train the police officers, even though it's in a junior style.
Yep.
Is very more not to use force first, and I feel like when it comes to like these topics, is very diverse, and they do believe in more community policing. So when I got to work with them, I got to see like they're more invested than what you see on the media, and I feel like the media kind of puts a negative perspective on all police, and that brings issues when it comes to different races who view police negatively. Because as a Hispanic person, I have no issue with the police, but when I see social media and I see certain instances, then it gives me that fear, like, well, this could happen here.
Yeah.
So I feel like the media also portrays a negative part on police.
The media is a huge problem. Boston does have a better than average police department. I said that before, I say it again. They have a much better than average police department. They do think a lot of things right. They're not perfect, and they do have officers who act badly, and that's, you know, when you have the commissioner, you'll see his passion. He cares about the community, and he cares about the police department. He wants the police to act well. You'll hear that from him. He's amazing. But I do think that you know, you always want to try to keep monitoring what people are doing. I mean, if we give the police an awesome amount of power, they're the only group we allow to take someone's life. And if we're going to give them that power, we have to hold them accountable for that and for their decisions that they make. It's a responsibility that they have to take seriously, and we have to take seriously our responsibility to monitor it. So I do think they train them well. I think they have good values. You know, the police commissioner, I don't know, 3 police commissioners ago, Paul Evans, instituted a policy, to go back to the road rage thing, that said you cannot fire at a car, moving car. Because his feeling was you're much more likely to kill somebody by shooting a bullet on the car and it bounces off somewhere and goes in and kills someone or hurts someone than to hurt the person in the car. And the police officers were furious and said, well, what happens if the guy's driving at you? He said, get out of the way. And, you know, it was that kind of thing. And very few police departments have that policy, but Boston's kept it. Because the idea is, you know, we'll get you again the next time. We don't have to risk a life here, you know. You're going to do something stupid later, and we'll get you then.
So I have PTSD, and one of my concerns walking around is, like, we talk about viral videos and things, is like reliving other people's trauma. So when we talk about accountability, like everybody having phones and maybe understanding police officers are human and they may or may not be having a bad day, but a citizen recording them having that bad day has an impact. One of my concerns is like around Tremont area, like one of my friends lives there, and he's walking, he's known interactions with police in the past before, and they were basically harassing him, and it like went viral, at which point I think the officer was like related to somebody like a
and don't you, I mean, one of the things that we've done as a society that is a mistake is we let social problems migrate down to the police, and they're not equipped to handle them. So way back 20 years ago, a big problem in this country was drunk driving, and we were losing 47,000 people a year to drunk driving. That number's down to about 12,000, no, about 18,000 now. One of the things that happened was the police made it a crime, and they did these. We had campaigns about designated drivers, but they also stopped people. They did, all kinds of different campaigns, and it worked. But then we gave the police all these other things that they're not capable of doing. We said, deal with domestic violence, arrest people, and that didn't work. And now as a society, we've pulled back from giving services to people with psychological disorders. And we don't have spaces, we don't have services, we don't support those. And so people then end up interacting with the police more and more. When we look at these videos, I can't tell you how many people are, people who are involved with some kind of psychological disorder, and they're maybe having an episode in a public place that's easy, that having a mental health professional there would help resolve it, but they got a police officer. The police officer's not been trained to deal with that, and it escalates. There are some cities now that are having mental health professionals or clinical social workers respond with police officers to some of those calls. I mean, it's expensive because you're paying two people to do that, but it does give somebody the ability to sort of assess a situation in a clinical way that's much better than just having a police officer out there doing it. But I think that the intersectionality question is really important, because as Ted said, with the example of the road rage, you're combining race and, in this case, a gun, or race and somebody who's standing up for their friend, and it's just a whole bunch of things that go on that make the situation, in the eyes of some police officers, more dangerous, and then they're going to act that way. So.
Yeah. Last two. Yes.
Okay. I've been in meetings about police and community before, and it always comes up that we should go back to walking our beat rather than riding. Do you have any opinion about that?
Yeah, we've done that a lot. There's lots of things that patrol modalities that are helpful. Walking is a helpful time, not on a night like this. I mean, who's out? No criminals are out. Don't go out walking around a park.
Summertime.
In the summertime, maybe it's okay. It's important. Bikes are helpful. But can I just get on a soapbox for a second, which is that they do say that all the time. Back when the cops walked the beat, we were all safe.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't. When the cops walked the beat, they walked the beat in the Irish section and the Italian section of town, and they took care of people that looked like them. They didn't walk beats in Roxbury. They didn't walk beats in Dorchester. No. They walked beats in sections of the town where they lived, and it was a lot of, hey, can you give me $50? I'll take care of you. There were lots of graft and corruption. It wasn't the good old days. People didn't get fair and equal policing, and there was lots of corruption. So we don't want to go back to those days. There are some things about knowing your community, being close to your community, that helps do better policing, and that's important and valuable. But let's not make the past into something it wasn't. It wasn't an egalitarian sort of wonderful world. It was if you happened to be Irish and your uncle was a cop.
Right. Exactly right. Last one.
I have a question, going back to the body camera data, and I have a question about the logistics of it. So of course they got all these records in public files, but how long will a police station have to hold on to these records? Where does a police station store hours and hours of body camera footage? What is this going to look like?
It's a great question. The cameras themselves are not an expense at all.
Mm-hmm.
They're cheap. It's storing the videos. So if you get thousands and thousands, this was 100 cameras, and we had, 43,000 videos. When we have 2,000 cameras, and they're going all day, That's what the big cost is to how to store the video. Now, agencies have said that what they do is, if anything happened on it, like if there was a use of force or an arrest, then they tag the video and they keep that one. But most of them aren't that. So they're gonna erase those in 6 to 9 months, depending on what agency, and that's their policy. But it is the case that that's the biggest expense. And then trying to figure out how to file it and what happened in, you know, it is the case that we're starting to collect data, and this is, you know, big data that you've all heard of. And we're starting to collect big data. We don't quite know how to manage it yet and what's there and what the resources are. But it is the case that that's the biggest challenge, is how much to keep, how do we store it, how do we categorize it, you know, when do we get rid of it, those kind of things. It's a great question.
A round of thanks for Professor Jack McDavid. See you next week. Stay warm.